Okay, like
Okay, it is recording.
That's how it works.
Yeah. But if we wake up at 9,
Is everyone ready?
do that.
Oh, I need a turn.
Well, something gotta get breakfast.
Oh, that is.
Yeah, annex.
I can do time signals if you prefer.
This is fine.
Just give like a middle finger with one. Slap somebody in.
Everyone ready? Mr. Speaker, the reality is the containment boards only do two things. They worsen the very controversial and worrisome ideologies that exist, and they obfuscate their very existence from the mainstream public. These will be both our contentions, beginning first with some model. Okay, so in terms of what we regret the existence of these boards, but more specifically, what that regret means is we think the world we're advocating is primarily defined by a few things. Firstly, note that boards on these controversial topics still exist. The difference is there's no containment, i.e. they aren't completely limited to these boards. Posting about them and other things don't result in bans. To give you more specifics, three points on sort of how we think this functions. People can post this content on main boards. They can discuss these controversial issues on sort of main boards of websites, be it primarily 4chan, Reddit, etc. Second point is that they can now cross-post / link to these pages and this content, which we think is important because it means that people on sort of the main, sort of more mainstream website are actually engaging or seeing these controversial topics. And third and finally, it's important to note that there is still a type of moderation. Oftentimes in these containment boards, there is little to no moderation given the controversial nature of what's discussed. So what this means is that there's still a type of moderation on main boards that exists. So harassment, abject racial slurs, etc. What this means essentially is that moderators still erase these things. They still keep track of these things, but there are no blanket subject bans. It means you can discuss controversial things, but they still must adhere to sort of these general guidelines that exist. Any questions about the model? Okay, 2 points. First, on radicalization, and second, on obfuscation of these issues. Okay, on radicalization and extremism, and why we think ultimately what containment boards do is fester the most dangerous and pernicious ideologies that exist within society and give them a place to only worsen and grow. We have three primary subpoints under this. First, they are a safe haven for extremist content. What this means is that ultimately, even if they begin with something that is only controversial in a minor way, the fact that it exists in complete isolation in a way that the rest of the site is both not paying attention to, but more importantly, not monitoring, we think it only tends to get worse. Furthermore, the view of the people in these boards is that this is a safe place for them to discuss these things, right? When you are on a board literally called, r/My Little Pony, you obviously feel comfortable discussing My Little Pony on said board. Though I think there are more interesting things to talk about, like white nationalism is probably a better controversial topic. I don't know why Gogo felt the need to include that in the info slide, but anyways. So we think that ultimately the people within these boards view them as a safe haven for this content. What this means is that they lose the sort of societal kickback that would normally result. In other words, the way in which mainstream public would respond to these things negatively, sort of point them out, be disapproving, etc. We think that societal influence is necessary to make them understand sort of the controversial nature of these things. But second point is that we think this results in a unique festering in which we sort of amplify these viewpoints, these desires, etc. 2 subpoints under this is that first, there are really no counterpoints that exist or no counter-argumentation that exists within these boards. Because the boards are entirely around the controversial subject, those who are against said subject or who would have dissenting opinions do not participate. They are either just most likely they are just banned, but if they are not, they are in such minor number that they are shot down and a group attacked by the rest of the thing. But secondly, we think that members of the group tend to encourage these types of views and standpoints. This is unsurprising. They hold these viewpoints, they want to be justified in holding them, and so they continuously make arguments, posts, comments, etc. that encourage these types of controversial subjects to perpetuate. This means that by existing within these boards, you exist in a place which you see nothing discouraging them and only things encouraging them. unsurprisingly, then, you have an amplification of the belief in these viewpoints and how you hold them true, etc., etc. Third and final point under this argument is there is a substantial lack of reporting. In other words, because these are left so isolated, particularly dangerous things like actual criminal planning exists within these controversial boards and is completely underreported or not reported at all. For example, the shooting that occurred at an African-American church in the South was talked about on 4chan. We think the reason those things are completely missed is because the very nature of containment boards encourages utter isolation. It encourages an environment in which no moderation is done, and thus there is no sort of preemptive check on these obviously dangerous things that can occur. Second argument, obfuscation of the existence of these issues, or the fact that they even exist. Okay, so the bottom line is that people in the status quo are unaware of these boards, communities, and even perhaps the issues themselves. An example of this is like NBC/Hillary Clinton/liberals discussing 4chan Pepe, right? It's like hilarious. They clearly have no idea what it is. They don't even understand sort of who these people are, the existence of these communities, what they believe, etc., etc. So what the model does, because we allow sort of cross-linking posting in the main boards, it means that you have to encounter these issues for what is essentially the first time. What this means is we have an enormous lack of discourse on their side of the house because of two things. First, there is like a blanket knowledge of other things. In other words, the idea that like sort of a Kekistani board or an RR/political board even exists on 4chan. Most people are completely unaware of this in the first place. But secondly, what we think is particularly unique about containment boards is it allows the mainstream community to view them as other. Because of the isolation that they have and the fact that there is no cross-posting, it is very easy to basically just dismiss them as outcasts, extremists, idiots, racists, whatever they sort of decide to delineate them as. But ultimately, that is harmful regardless of what they believe in, because that complete sort of pushing to the side and viewing them as other is inevitably a complete lack of discourse. We think that is bad on either side of the house. We think the impacts here are things like Trump, where there was such a lack of connection between these vast swaths of controversial communities that ended up pouring out in support for Trump that we had no way of predicting it would come. Earlier, I mentioned the idea of like mass shootings or school shootings. We think these are very real impacts when you are completely unaware of the dangerous and pernicious ideologies and communities that exist within these sites that are continuing to fester themselves so dangerously, as mentioned in the first argument. Ultimately, you need discourse at the very least to understand these issues. We don't think this is something like some hippie liberal paradise where it's like, we'll just resolve our differences via discourse. But we think that ultimately discourse is substantially better than no discourse, where we are either unaware of the issue in and of itself, or we simply push these people to a group by which we take no note of, and thus they catch us by surprise. Mr. Speaker, we do not think containment boards protect the public. We think they instead insulate them in a way that is far more dangerous than exposure to these controversial ideas would ever do. We are proud to propose. Thank you. Sorry, Ram.
Before I get into my speech, let me point out something very clear here. The key issue that we're discussing throughout this debate should be about what brings about the most meaningful discussion of these controversial ideas. And when we say meaningful, we mean, as the opposition, one in which people can say things without taking it too personally and are able to express their opinions freely so that others can understand them and understand their backgrounds, their beliefs, and their causes. Now, one thing we do know is there's two things I noticed about. I'm not going to. Basically, I'll respond to the government's argument. So they first bring up this idea that these discussion boards essentially create this sort of safe haven in which those who want to discuss these controversial topics only discuss in a way in which it only worsens these extremist ideas, worsens these wrongful beliefs. Now, keep in mind here that our response is basically that while it does limit these discussions to certain areas, these people in these certain discussion areas can be honest because they know that others cannot see what they say. And that honesty, we believe, is important because it enables them to express opinions that otherwise would not be able to be expressed in a public forum. And in that sense, that brings about meaningful debate, because in a meaningful debate, those who express their opinions express it with conviction and have a certain understanding of it. Now that leads to their second argument, and it does not lead to a sort of understanding. These people will probably create these discussion boards in which a whole bunch of people come together who have no idea what they're talking about and just freely rant about whatever the hell they want. They know that everybody else in the discussion board encourages them to do so. Well, to be honest, there are totally possibilities for that. So really, in this debate, we both have to consider that there will be discussion boards out there where people will just come in and totally rant about their ideas without any understanding them. And there will also possibly be discussion boards which people come in more prepared, properly informed about the issues they're prepared to discuss, and that we believe is important. The reason why, essentially, before I get into my main contentions, the reason why we believe our side wins in this debate is because we believe there's a higher opportunity for meaningful discussion through allowing containment boards, not now. Now, essentially, our two contentions are this. Containment boards are good because it ensures that people don't get offended. People that are outside these containment boards do not get offended. And number two, our second contention is that it brings about the most informed discussion. Now, we understand that the government has just said that it brings about uninformed discussion. We'll offer warrants as to why that may not be true, and why our side wins the most when we consider the whole entire world population of what probabilities may occur. So our first claim is essentially that containment boards are good because it best ensures that people don't get offended. And why is this true? Our first warning is essentially that people expect controversy when they go into these containment boards. And when they go into these containment boards, they expect controversy. And thus, when they see it, they're like, okay, I expected people, for example, if you look at a containment board, let's say talking about blacks' rights, and they go in there, and the African-American person goes in there and sees, okay, there's just some white supremacists complaining about how blacks are dumb or stupid or whatever. He's already mentally prepared to see things like this because this discussion board on its huge title says this is going to discuss whether we should allow rights for blacks and whites. And because of that, they are already mentally prepared. So they're already prepared that they might get offended, and thus they're less offended if they did not even see it coming in the first place. And our second warning as to why this is true is because people who intend to talk about this controversy are more likely to participate. Because they see this controversial topic on the huge board, they come in saying, all right, if they enter the discussion board, we're assuming that because it's limited, they have to go through some type of process to enter it. And when they're trying to enter it, they enter with this type of intention that they are willing to add something to this debate, or at least want to see what's going on in this debate. And thus, people who intend to talk about this controversy are more likely to participate because they already come in with the intent to at least contribute something. And for example, when you look at philosophy debates about abortion, all the people that go to these specially sanctioned events are, yes?
The reason containment is in the name containment boards is because it inherently limits the amount of interaction between these groups and the rest of the website. So even if you say that people can go in and have debates, that's meaningless when you consider the tiny minority of people which will ever do that.
So you're saying that we do not believe that people will just not enter discussion boards. We believe people are open to ideas, and thus they'll enter discussion boards that they intend to actively participate in. And our third warning was why containment boards are good because it best ensures that people don't get offended is essentially that it is self-filtering. People who enter this discussion board essentially enter it with the intention to either contribute or at least understand what's going on in this discussion board. If they don't like it, they can leave. But essentially it's self-filtering because people go in there and they have the choice as to whether they want to stay in it or leave. It doesn't come out in their newspaper every day on the front line page whether they like it or not. It's there whether they choose to enter it or not. Now, our second claim is essentially that these containment boards are good because they bring about the most informed discussion. Now, the government has just told you that it leads to uninformed discussion, in which people just rant about topics they do not just fully understand. And the reason why we believe our side is true, in which we believe that it brings about informed discussion, is essentially number one, that people who come in prepared to discuss these topics, and thus, if they want to go in prepared to explain something to other people in this discussion board, if they want to go in and try to persuade other people of their idea, they come in with evidence, they come in with warrants, they come in with impacts. And because of that, just for example, in this debate today, people come in prepared to talk about whatever they're discussing. And thus, we believe it brings about informed debates because people come in with this idea that they're tending to get their opinion known and get it known persuasively. Now, when we look at this debate as a whole, you see that the most important key issue, not here. How much time do I have? Jeez, I don't even know. All right, 30 seconds. All right, so essentially, the most important key issue here is to bring about the most meaningful debate. And yes, we have to consider that there will be discussion boards out there in which people go in not knowing what they want. Well, if people go in not knowing understand this issue, those who enter it and are offended by it, those who enter it and do know and don't like what people are saying, they can leave. But essentially, we believe it shouldn't be out there in the whole wide universe for everybody to see, because some people might take it emotionally. Some people might take it unappealingly. And as a result, this will lead to conflicts that are beyond just meaningful debate. This will lead to situations in which people actively protest, situations where violence might occur because of the emotional aggression caused by this offensive statements that some uninformed people on these discussion boards talked about. And essentially, we believe that it's important to create containment boards because essentially that people not only are going in there prepared to see possibly offensive comments, but second of all, these people who intend to let their opinion persuade others of their opinion go in prepared evidence, go in with ideas they intend to contribute both meaningfully and persuasively. Thank you.
Thank you. Your opposition for remarks is also the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver a speech not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Oh,
Jesus.
okay, good.
I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you why the impacts that Dennis gave you on radicalization and the increase in extremism are more important than anything else in this round, and why that should be weighed above all else. But secondly, I'm going to talk to you about why this radicalization happens, why extremism increases, and what that means in the context of the world and tangible impacts that we can see. Thirdly, though, I'm going to talk to you about political discourse, why we get worse political discourse when we have these containment boards, and how even this outweighs the points about emotional trauma that we got out of it. Okay, first of all, we tell you that the most important thing in this round is the proliferation of extremism and radicalization. Why is this the case? 2 reasons. 1, because it leads to a tangible loss of life, which is a first-order harm. That is to say, I don't particularly care if I am emotionally traumatized if I am dead, right? It is far greater a harm for people to literally die because of these containment boards than to be offended in some sort of nebulous sense. Secondly, though, we tell you that this is the most deterministic impact in this round. That these talks about whatever opposition might bring you about how we get perhaps better clash and better sorts of debates about these topics that are more intellectual. These political discourse points might be moving back and forth throughout this round, but even those are a little bit nebulous in nature. This is a tangible impact that we can draw a direct link to, and that is why this should be preferred above that. Okay, with that, a couple things in terms of overview as to why more extremism and radicalization happens when these containment boards exist. 2 things. First of all, with containment, only extremists go to these boards because normal people, A, don't know they exist, and B, are fundamentally uncomfortable dealing with these sorts of people, right? I don't like to deal with white, supremacists, right? They make me uncomfortable, and therefore I'm going to avoid these boards, even if I do know they exist. But the larger issue is that because these cross-postings aren't allowed to happen, these people aren't able to post in, the main page and, link their, cancer group, means that, I literally don't know they exist in the first place. The second thing, though, is that extremists, if they can, like spreading hate everywhere. That is fundamental to who they are. They like spreading this kind of shit. So when the shooter who shot up that church in South Carolina, Dylan Church was the name, I think, when he posts on 4chan, right, he's more likely to post on the main page if he doesn't get insta-banned and his post is deleted. Critically, even if he does post in the main page, in the status quo, his post is deleted. So that effectively doesn't lead to any sort of awareness. Because in our world, on government side, that we let people see the sort of thing, we foster more awareness that these things are going to happen. Okay, so with that, why does radicalization increase and why does extremism get worse? Dennis gave you 3 sophisticated reasons. Got no response out of opposition. They're going to need to respond to them if they want to win this round. The first thing he told you is that it creates a safe haven for extremist content, which removes the feeling that this is socially unacceptable, which is a driver behind how many people hold their opinions, right? The comparative is these people post these opinions on the main page and are lambasted on the public scene and therefore perhaps question their own extremism, and like budding extremists perhaps don't become extremists on our side. The second thing, though, is that it festers and builds on itself through the encouragement of extremism because people who are on these boards are already extremists. So this means that when I'm a budding extremist, that I go to this board and I become more extremist because the extremists are kind of like shouting at me to be like more hateful of like black people, right? And those are the things that I see and I interact with, and those are the things that are encouraged. This means that the shooter now posts on the page, I'm going to go shoot up a black church, and gets rousing encouragement from everyone else in the chat because everyone thinks that this is a good thing within that group, and there are no normal people within this group for the reasons I told you. The third thing that Dennis told you is that you get no awareness. So even if it is the case that the last two warrants I gave you were false, this wins us this round because when this shooter posts in this group and no normal people see it, then no one reports it to the police and this doesn't get stopped. When the shooter is instead allowed to post it on the main page, everyone sees it, someone reports it to the police, the shooting doesn't happen. That is critical in this round. So what are the impacts of this? First of all, you get more shootings, right? Because like you get more like racially motivated shootings and things that are stemming from extremism. Secondly, though, you get less recognition and reporting of these shootings. So even if you don't get like more shootings on our side of the house, the fact that they don't get reported means that more of them actually happen, which leads to the terminal impacts literally for these people, which is bad. Thirdly, though, is that you get more suicide and self-harm. So this is like a kind of like a secondary impact here where you go to these pages where like other people are talking about like anorexia and bulimia, and you start buying into that because you get encouraged in that forum and there's no like third-party voice that's telling you that this is bad. So you get those sorts of bad impacts as well. On a more nebulous level, though, we think that you also get an increase in racism, white supremacy, vitriol against LGBTQ plus people, and an increase in violent tendencies and ideology writ large. All of these things are the most important thing in this round, and they need to prove to you how these violent tendencies and radicalism and extremism get stopped on their side of the house with containment boards if they want to have a chance of outweighing against the loss of life that we provided you on opening government. Secondly, though, let's talk about political discourse, why you get worse political discourse when you have these sorts of containment boards, right? Note that this also weighs over emotional trauma. Why is this the case? One, because you get far more emotional trauma when people like Trump get elected because the left is unaware of the volume of people that believe in these sorts of things or unaware that they even exist in the first place, right? This means that they get more sorts of emotional trauma. Second of all, though, that we think that we ought to prefer the actual political benefits in terms of discourse that we get on our side over like small amounts of emotional trauma from people seeing a few posts on the internet when the internet is a shithole, as we all know already, right? Like you have some expectation of cancer when you go on the internet. Okay. The only response to this, right, is that we got that like people will go on to these like controversial like containment like groups because they want to be like part of the discussion, right? A few reasons why this doesn't happen. I already told you they don't know they exist, and second of all, that in reality people live within echo chambers because echo chambers are comfortable, right? That's why people don't leave echo chambers and go into these containment groups. This means these people never see it. So Dennis gave you 3 reasons why you get worse kind of political discourse. One, it obfuscates the existence of these ideologies. You can't post things that you don't know exist. Second of all, that it causes the mainstream to label these individuals as outcasts, but also critically the minority. They don't know the volume of these individuals because they never interact with them on a regular basis. Thirdly, though, is that it precludes the possibility of changing your mind because you never see these sorts of viewpoints unless you want to already, by which point you probably either decided whether it's right or wrong in the first place, so there's no way that you change your mind. The impact of this is that you get things like Trump, but you also get things like worse policy around things like birth control and things like that because you're unable to see what the other side thinks and properly argue against it. At the end of the day, we've shown you how you lose more life when you have these sorts of containment boards because more like shootings and things like that happen, but you also get worse political discourse. We're incredibly proud of those.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his eloquent remarks, and call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to deliver a speech not exceeding 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, I would encourage you to weigh this round on not what they said on side government, but instead to weigh this round on how we do not regret containment boards, because we believe that containment boards will that they contribute to more productive, meaningful discussions among those concerned, while also offending the least number, and also having discussions that are about the things that they actually care about. And so before I go into, so I guess I'll go into some extraneous rebuttal on some of the points that side government brought up, and then I'll go into the 2 points. I'll expand upon the 2 points that my partner brought up, which are, 1, that the least number would be offended by these containment boards, and 2, that these containment boards keep discussion directed and contained. And then I'll go into and then I'll interweave some more rebuttal into that. So for some extraneous rebuttal about their point on how they would on their point, they said that they would allow that containment boards would allow the mainstream view, and they said that containment boards will contribute to the view of of certain outside opinions as other, and how this would result in complete lack of this would result in less discourse about certain topics, especially since there's no cross pollination with the ban of cross posting. We say that even though there's no direct ability to cross post, we say that some of the ideas that are brought up in these discussion forums can result in interest in some topics and subjects that might be mentioned in these forums, and that if the participants in these forums really are interested in those topics, that they would look up some of those references, and potentially find these other sub forums that government says may be hard to find. Yes.
So why is it bad if people are allowed to talk about My Little Pony in general forums on 4chan?
Okay. Well, in that case, with My Little Pony, it's not very. Oh well, My Little Pony isn't a super disruptive topic unless you bring up some weird edge thing about My Little Ponies. But we are saying about other more controversial topics that may be offensive to people, depending on their race, identity, or the opinions they believe on. We say that a lot of these more offensive subreddits or topics and boards should be contained in their own isolated boards, and not have discussion within among major forums. Yeah.
But you're seriously lacking comparative here, and that Pranav tells you both the impacts on our side are more important, but he also tells you sort of why that won't happen in the first place.
Okay, so I was going to go into that a little bit more. So you guys said that the public would be isolated from these. That the public would be isolated from these these cross posts. But we say that it's not necessarily bad if many of them want to be isolated, or many of them do not want to be experience these disruptive opinions or disruptive posts in the first place, and that's why we do not regret these containment boards. Also, you guys said that containment boards would worsen political discourse. One, because that they are unknown, and 2, because they are uncomfortable. We say that it's not necessarily bad if these super disruptive topics that could potentially cause chaos, chaotic discussions among these main forums are brought up, and say that they should be isolated in their own things. So now on to my first point that my partner brought up, which is that by having these containment boards, the least number of people would be offended, because firstly they would be prepared for the discussions on these boards, and not caught off guard suddenly by some offensive material, by joining these boards, by opting in to join these boards, and by opting in to join these boards, they are acknowledging that they are acknowledging that they may experience controversial materials, and that they are prepared for this. Yes.
What is more offensive, encountering a white nationalist article on Reddit or seeing the election of Trump and literal Nazis marching in the streets?
Well, I guess we could say that like both of them are like potentially offensive, but like we want to like just minimize like offensiveness, and we say that like these boards, like even though like you guys say that they may like foster like radicalism and like I guess like these parades, but potentially these parades and have like effects outside of these forums, like potential death and whatnot. We say that that like we say that like these sorts of things will never really be solved, and then they'll continue to exist, but at least they're like contained in some sort of like board, yeah. And so like on your third point about like how there would be no awareness, how there would be no awareness, and that there would be no awareness for these topics, and that there would be like little moderation for these. There would be little moderation for these like subreddits or like boards versus the main boards, and how that could potentially be dangerous versus like main boards who have a lot of people to, I guess like filter things out. We say that that like if this affects this affects discussion, and if it's dangerous, that they can leave. And then I guess like onto my second point that my partner onto the second point that my partner brought up about like how this keeps discussions directed and contained. We say that again that like people are willing to hear these opinions when they join these discussions. They are self-filtering, and that ultimately they will lead to more like more discussions that are like that can be like heated or like productive towards like the topics of those specific boards. And that ultimately like on our side we advocate the most productive, meaningful discussions for the topics that those are topics people are interested about, and also have discussions about the things that people are concerned about while also offending the least number, and that is why we are proud to propose.
Okay, I'm sorry to totally throw it off you. Could you see my I will return from the discuss.
I'm gonna move this back. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Thinking like a gentle slide. It's still recording, right?
Yeah, it is.
I hate when I'm writing like a note for purposes. I'm just like, I need to keep going. I need to slow the next speech.
Sure. Opening half talks a lot about these super radical groups fostering things like white supremacists, terrorists, etc. Fundamentally, those are not the only things that exist within containment boards. You also have things like My Little Pony, like Homestuck, like really dank memes or stuff like that that ends up being set up in an area by which they become increasingly radical, increasingly problematic. We're going to win to you on that front, but we're also happy to win to you on exactly the sort of stuff that you hear out of opening half. So firstly, let's talk about perception, why you actually get less enjoyment on behalf of individuals and their particular interests on their side. So fundamentally, we say some of the things that get contained within containment boards aren't particularly controversial. So i.e. you have things like My Little Pony, which are societally perceived as being a little bit problematic for like middle-aged white people, like white adults to be watching, but like that's not necessarily something that's inherently bad. The problem that actually exists here is that these individuals aren't actually able to properly engage in their particular interests because they feel like it's something that's not actually fostered by society, right? So society doesn't actually change their beliefs on these particular people. These people only have this one particular form in which they could express themselves. The problem that exists there is that you get less utility on the part of these individuals and their ability to actually enjoy themselves in terms of their particular interests. But secondly, that society doesn't actually change its particular viewpoints on a lot of these issues, right? So things like in terms of, let's say, like men being interested in grown men being interested in things that are a little bit more childish or a little bit more like feminine. We say that that sort of thing is something that we should be societally perceived as being okay. That doesn't actually happen on their side of the house when people see something like this starting to foster and then institutionalizedly put it into the containment board so that nobody actually engages with it. Secondly, we think the other thing that exists within containment boards on things like Reddit is things like polyamory or polygamy. We think on those sorts of fronts, that's an equal forum on which we don't actually think these sorts of things should be controversialized and stigmatized against. We think it's much less likely that that's going to happen on our side of the house when you're able to actually access open forums. And with these places aren't actually placed with the taboo name of containment boards, which means that people are more likely to actually understand exactly why the people enjoy the things that they actually enjoy. So we say on broader society, we're able to get that particular impact. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what everything OG talks about in terms of awareness about controversy and apply this strictly to individuals, because we think that individuals are strictly a lot more harmed within this containment boards on their side of the house. So we say that what realistically happens is that people who need help are much, much less likely to actually seek help on their side. Few reasons for this. One, we think that once somebody joins a containment board, that containment board runs on the rhetoric of the fact that the majority doesn't actually accept them. Therefore, they're much less likely to actually seek outside of that board when it comes to things like help, when it comes to things like treatment, when it comes to sort of understanding exactly what is sort of problematic about this sort of format in society that they're in. So that we say that not only applies to things like anorexia, but we also think it applies to people that are particularly alone and see like a white supremacist group as the only society in which they can actually feel comfortable. We say on our side is that it's much less likely that you're going to have something like that because people recognize and look out and see that other people exist that are actually able to help them. We say these individuals are more likely to actually live better lives on our side because they actually realize that these sorts of other options exist. Okay, second point that I want to talk about is like within radical boards. So, within radical boards. So in opposition, the fundamental thing is that containment boards are labeled as controversial. So opening government talks about how this means that normal people are not going to join. We say this also means that more moderate people that share the same sorts of beliefs as the radicals are also less likely to go join. So for example, moderate white supremacists are less likely to join a containment board for white supremacists insofar it is actually so radical to the point that it is absurd. The problem that exists here is that the means by which you actually get the moderation of things like radicals is through actually members of the same sort of group who are actually most moderate. That's the way in which more radical individuals are most likely to first be reined in so that the general public as a whole can change their views on the whole front. So before you actually get the impacts and the mechanism that OG talks about, we think you have to first rely on what we're talking about here, which is moderates within those particular groups that are actually changing those minds of those radicals and pulling them a little bit in closer to center. Sure.
What would you describe as a moderate white supremacist?
So we think someone that's just like kind of racist and like sort of like doesn't like this like basically doesn't like people of other races, but doesn't necessarily actively act out in the streets in a violent way, for example. That's something that exists. Okay, let's talk about what we hear out of opposition. So we hear a couple of things. The first thing that they talk about is honesty is much more likely within a containment board, and therefore that's something that's good. We say that this is something that we don't actually want to allow to foster, right? So we don't want to have a bunch of people's, like a bunch of terrorists, for example, in a board, having the ability to freely talk about exactly how they're going to plan out acts of violence. So we think insofar as you have external moderation as a factor that can actually exist there, that prevents these individuals from actually engaging in those particular plots, like talking about each other in a way and talking to each other in a way that's increasingly radical. We think that insofar as you get rid of that ability for them to engage in that discourse, they're less able to actually radicalize, they're less able to actually carry out the most heinous sort of acts. The second thing that they talk about this idea is that basically containment boards provide content warnings, and therefore individuals understand what they're getting themselves into. You can have better dialogue. That's their claim on opposition. 4 responses to this. First of all, we say that you could totally moderate an open forum so that the most heinous stuff doesn't actually like come out and get seen by like little kids or something. We think that's something that's totally okay. Secondly, we say that people are more likely to realize precisely how awful things are when they're actually exposed to them in open forums. So we totally want people to actually see the horrors of what people actually believe and exactly get outraged on behalf of that, because we say that that's the mechanism by which these people are actually going to care and are actually going to ignite on change. So i.e. this means engaging with these people directly and explaining to them specifically why their opinions are problematic, or in terms of trying to get some sort of grandstanding policy change by which we could ensure that this sort of thing is like actually gets quelled properly. So we say that's the mechanism by which that happens. Thirdly, we say that lots of things in containment boards, as I said, aren't actually super controversial. So insofar as that's the case, we don't see as reasonable for you to actually have those containment boards in the first place. We say that's something that's problematic because you don't actually get the most enjoyable discussion on people that have particularly niche interests that might be outcast from society. But fourthly, we say that normal people and fundamentally just are not going to join a lot of these containment boards and actually engage with individuals insofar as they are as taboo as they say they are. So even people who are interested in this particular discussion, are willing to help these individuals, are willing to engage with them, are much less likely to do so because they're going to face backlash on behalf of the rest of the society if they do so join. So the problem that exists there is that even those that want to help are not only going to be crushed by radicals that exist within containment boards, but they're also going to be crushed by the rest of the society who sees what them joining as an act that's particularly heinous. Crucially, what we talk to you here about closing government is that not only are a lot of these cases we want society to move forwards, and that means not having these particular containment boards, but also that we get the best possible help for individuals in their times of need. Very proud to propose. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think you did great.
No, you did do. Like when you mentioned modern
wow.
white supremacy, modern white supremacists wanted to join a community.
So the whole assumption that everyone is operating under today is the assumption that these people will actually post on the main board. Now, this is an assumption, indeed, and this means that this assumption is wrong, and we'll look into this more later on. So let's look at the main arguments that the other side made. Now, one of their arguments was that people will not get help, for example, within boards where people will have anorexia, bulimia, or other mental disorders where they will further encourage each other to actually foster these beliefs. However, because mainstream media websites are actually in charge of these forum boards, this means they have the power to actually include, for example, suicide hotline numbers on their boards and on their pages, which would actually allow for people to seek help if they need it. Furthermore, because they have to actually enter these mainstream websites in order to actually enter the forum boards themselves, you could have these mainstream media websites actually include the numbers and the help that offer help on the front page. Whereas people with these diseases and disorders, once they don't have containment boards, they won't turn to these mainstream websites. Rather, they'll turn to other websites catered completely for these people. For example, there are whole entire websites catering towards people with suicide tendencies. So this means that because these websites exist, they'll turn to these instead, rather than going to these mainstream media boards, which may be more popular. Now, the next thing was, the next argument they made was that moderate people will, for example, moderate white supremacists will not join in on discussion with extremists. However, moderate white supremacists, like my other half had argued, will not contribute anyway because they already intrinsically keep these ideas and views to themselves. They wouldn't want to engage in public discourse of this anyway. Not right now. So moving on to a little bit of what Top Half actually talked about, and then we'll move on to our own arguments. So one thing that Top Half said was that of radicalization with extremists. Now, again, like I had said earlier, the anorexia analogy also applies here. Because there are whole websites dedicated to people with extremist views, they would rather turn to these instead because there aren't none of these containment boards available.
So when you label these things, like when you get rid of the label of containment boards, it not only have people moving from there into mainstream boards, but you also have people from mainstream boards actually moving in and engaging those people and actually trying to help.
The whole idea is that these people, once they don't have containment boards, wouldn't want to even engage in these mainstream websites anymore. They would rather just completely disregard this and turn to these other extremist websites. And the reason for this is because these containment boards were safe spaces for these people to allow these ideas to foster. And once they have these mainstream websites only, they'll see that other people aren't willing to engage with them and will be berating them for their opinions. So they wouldn't want to post in these places where no one else is offering them support. So moving on to what I was saying earlier. because these whole websites exist by allowing them, it actually makes it easier to moderate if these containment boards still exist, because then these people will stay within these containment boards rather than moving on to the other websites. And at least this allows us an ability to actually kind of moderate this. The whole problem that Top Half was arguing about was that we aren't moderating them enough. Why don't we just simply moderate these containment boards better? We actually have a place to have these people and are able to observe their actions rather than have them move on to complete websites, which we have no idea about, not at this moment. So there's also this idea of the dark net, this whole part of the website that most of us don't know about. This is where a lot of black market dealings happen and where people sell and trade guns illegally. Now, these people who are on containment boards would be able to talk about this sort of thing openly. This allows the police, if they want to actually go in and look at these dealings without having to look at these other websites, because most people don't know about these websites. Yes?
So first of all, I don't think like Reddit and 4chan are like mainstream media, but also these sites exist, the sites you're talking about exist on both sides of the house. The difference is on your side of the house, their groups, their communities are branded as something that need to be contained. We think that is more likely to push them to these sites you're talking about than us saying they don't need to be contained.
I feel that by having these containment boards, it wouldn't push them away because, like I said earlier, I'll just summarize really quickly. Without these containment boards, if we look at that world specifically, this means that people, for example, white supremacists, will maybe, if they wanted to, would post something that is racist. Then, of course, a lot of the more moderate people will berate this person for saying these racist ideas. And once they berate them, these white supremacists won't want to engage with this. They won't want to be posting in a board where there is no support. Therefore, they will move on to these websites because what they are looking for is this community and support. The next thing that the first Top Half talked about was obfuscation. And they talked about how mainstream people aren't aware of these communities. But it's clear by this discussion in general that we are aware of these communities because they are existent in these containment boards. Mainstream people are highly aware of these. We can look at this by the fact that we all laughed when we saw My Little Pony. We all know what this is. And so we can look at the example of like Hillary Clinton, but those are older people. Those are a different generation. People do know about these containment boards, which actually allows us to moderate it better. Furthermore, let's move on to our own arguments. So our first and main argument is that of community. Now, we are obviously not just looking at the extremist views, but by having these extremist views, we within containment boards, we're able to better moderate it. But we also have communities such as My Little Pony. By having these communities where these people are able to freely talk to each other, then they're able to express themselves and actually feel safe and comfortable doing this. But without these containment boards, these people won't want to post on the main boards because, like my opponent had said, they are stigmatized, and rather this would increase stigmatization, and this would increase this would increase the feeling of otherness that they already feel so much. This would actually make them feel so much worse, and this could lead to mental health issues because of this inability to connect with other people. So the impact, again, would be lack of social health, and which would lead to worsening mental health and physical health as well. So, Judge, when you look at this round today, it's clear that we have won both sides. I have 30 seconds left. No?
It's 7 minutes.
Okay, we win on both sides. Cool.
Yeah.
Two questions to sum up this round. Firstly, how do we best get discussion? Secondly, how do we best dispel hateful discourse? Okay, let's get right into the questions. all clashes are within the question. So first question, how do we best get discussion? Okay, let's look at what opening opposition gives you on this idea, right? You tell you firstly in the first speech that you get more meaningful discussion because it's more honest. We think that opening government deals with this when they tell you that the comparative is that you actually get minimal to no discussion. I think that overall the comparative that is happening is that they want more meaningful discussion, but we tell you that discussion doesn't happen at all. But even if you don't buy any of opening government's arguments, right, we tell you that even if discussion were to happen, this wouldn't be discussion in favor of these more radical groups, right? We tell you that by having containment boards, you delegitimize a lot of these opinions because they're inherently otherized. Second point of clash, opening opposition tells you that there is an expectation of controversy going into these containment boards, so therefore people will be self-filtering, there'll be less clash, right? So insofar as opening opposition or opposition as a whole, it doesn't prove to you that anyone outside of radical communities would choose to enter these communities, then you don't access any of these benefits that they give you. We don't think that there would be any meaningful discussion within containment boards because by nature of being containment boards, they're segregated to people who have the same opinion. This also deals with a lot of clash about informed discussions, right? What does Luke give you under the idea of discussion? He tells you more about the reality of containment boards. He tells you that the perception of all communities in containment board is bad for those those containment boards that aren't inherently pernicious. These are things like sexual preferences. We don't think that these things inherently are as bad as things like white supremacy, right? So the danger of grouping and labeling all of these under the same label of putting them into containment groups is that you otherize and you discriminate and you stigmatize things that aren't necessarily bad, but then you limit all discussion on those things as well as in the same way that we would things like white supremacy. Okay, what does closing opposition give you in refutation? They firstly tell you that, the only thing they really tell you is that they create a safe community, and that is great for the people within these communities, who are being otherized by containment boards, right? We tell you that even if the safe community exists within a containment board, societal views never change. This means that necessarily they aren't safe from the larger community. We don't think that you get any of the benefits when you have containment boards and you segregate these people into a very concentrated population of this is an interest which needs a containment board, which is therefore obviously very bad. Okay, more under this idea of discussion from closing opposition is that they tell you that we already know about the containment boards, therefore we should just dispel them into mainstream media because it's already a fact that's known. We tell you that no, this doesn't happen because by nature of having containment boards means that a lot of the intricacies of the arguments and what people actually think are contained within this internet environment, right? We don't think that we actually understand what a lot of these containment boards talk about. Okay, but let's move on to the second question about how do we best dispel hateful discourse. Okay, opening opposition gives you this idea that you get more informed debates within containment groups, right? They tell you that this is the best way in which people can actually figure out their differences under within a safe environment. The problem that occurs here is that within containment groups, you necessarily create echo chambers. This means that within a containment group, a white supremacist group, you have little to none disagreement within the group because everyone inherently has the same beliefs. This means that the type of discussion that's more likely to happen within containment groups isn't about, oh, is it right that we think that we're white supremacists? It's more oh, how should we subjugate people of other races? It's not the type of discussions that they tell you happen within containment groups actually necessarily hurt them because they're just effectively saying the same things to each other. The creation of an echo chamber is harmful for more moderacy, right? What does Luke give you in his extension, which is incredibly important under this idea? He firstly tells you that, okay, there is an overall mischaracterization of ideas within containment groups at the point at which, people who are within a containment group, are less likely to seek out help because they have been stigmatized against as a result of the existence of a containment group. Okay, what does closing opposition give you in response to this extension? They tell you that people wouldn't be able to turn to mainstream media boards under the other comparative, right? They say that people will turn to other avenues such as smaller websites. We say that smaller websites, the whole idea of that is already existing when you have containment boards. But so essentially this point is at best a wash because it's going to happen on both sides of the house. What we effectively stand for is that we have more we dispel more of these opinions into mainstream media. Luke also tells you about this idea about like a taboo name against otherwise interests, right? We think that this is necessarily harmful because it propels like an inherent lack of engagement. So insofar as an opinion isn't like actually offensive, but it gets put into like a containment group because people are like uncomfortable with it, then these people are much less likely to engage with the general public and talk about like the things that they actually want to talk about. So know that this actually tackles a lot of the discussion arguments coming out of opposition, because once you have a taboo label on a lot of the topics being discussed in these containment groups, there's a lot like less likelihood that there will be further discussion about a lot of the topics. Okay, Luke tells you, thirdly, this very important idea about moderate engagement, right? Because we tell you that the most likely solution to dispel hateful discourse is if we have people who aren't as radical, like moderate radicals is what we're going to call them. If we have moderate radicals, like engage in discourse with like people who are very, very radical, right? So what does closing opposition tell you in response to this? We tell you that, well, like moderate radicals wouldn't engage like either way. We say that they're much more likely to engage when we remove the idea of like taboos surrounding containment groups. They think that like moderate discussion is more likely to happen when it isn't like this festering radical community, when it's actually like a spectrum of people like for like with different varying levels of like radicalisms about what they believe. Okay, third idea, like another point of clash under this second question is that closing opposition gives you this extension about how like containment boards are good for like hateful discourse because we can moderate this hateful discourse. Okay, three responses to this. Firstly, we tell you that like radical moderation is usually the type of moderation that happens within containment boards. It's not like moderate moderation. Like secondly is that like inherently by being a containment board, it's a safe space for a lot of these hateful comments. Therefore, like moderation goes against the very inherent nature of like being a containment board. Thirdly, we tell you that even if you don't buy any of this analysis, we tell you that if we had like heavy moderation of these containment boards, people would be more inclined to move to like a lot of the pernicious smaller websites that they try to convince you exist, that people will move to anyways. So we think that that is actually necessarily more harmful, because then these smaller websites, which are like very harmful, as they say to people, would be the main avenue that they turn to. Okay, the comparative that we want to give you at the end of the day is that we get actual discussion, they get none. We think that any kind of meaningful discussion only happens when you like remove the taboo label that exists inherently on containment groups. We're proud to propose.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
All right, now to close out the round with the speech not exceeding 7 minutes.
Hey, babe, can you tell me?
Please keep it professional.
You bet, yeah. Oh, can you give me singles?
What, do you think I'm a hypocrite or something?
No.
I can. This'll.
No, I don't know. Mr. Speaker, distinguished guests, my fellow Americans, today you heard a vast array of arguments. But what tonight ultimately boils down to is the quality of our discourse and how it can best be effectualized on the internet. Whether containment boards or main boards are the best modes for articulating thoughts. Let's discuss containment boards and the fact that they host diverse topics. Yes, they do host some extremist content. Yes, they do host My Little Pony. Yes, they do host Hillary Clinton. But they also host topics pertaining to Hillary Clinton. But they also host incredibly important and controversial issues pertaining to marginalized communities. Communities such as homosexuals. Communities such as minorities, racial minorities, religious minorities. These containment boards create for them valuable safe spaces for them to be able to engage one another in thoughts. Thoughts that, if put out in the open, could be labeled by the oppressive established authority as stupid, as far left, liberal, socialist, communist, evil, wicked, parasitic. I love containment boards. Let's talk about extremists for a sec. Notice how the government's entire argument is predicated on the acts of extremists. Well, Islam has extremists. Christians have extremists. People who love marshmallows have extremist factions. Every single faction that exists has extremists in them. And what the government does is they draw on a slim minority of the actual population that exists. And they predicate their entire argument on the small faction's behavior. And it's just not right or fair. So consider this. Let's say that there were no containment boards. There were no containment boards for these extremists to discuss mass shootings, to discuss terrorist attacks. Well, in 2001, the September 11th attacks were carried out. Were they carried out because of containment boards? No. As a matter of fact, terrorists communicated vis-a-vis email. That's right, email. In the government's world, they would get rid of email. If they want to get rid of email, they're going to have to, man, they're screwed up, you know? Man, screw them. But also, consider mass shootings. Mass shootings have been a phenomenon in our country for a long time now. But many mass shootings were not the result of containment boards. In fact, the majority of them were not carried out because of containment boards. Consider this. Let's say there was a mass shooter. There are no containment boards in this world. So he decides, hey, you know what? I'll post it on the main board and everyone's going to support me and love me and it's going to be great. So he posts it. Then, Dennis, our good friend, he types, oh man, hey, mass shootings are bad. Don't plan to shoot up that school. The gunman goes back on his computer 3 o'clock in the morning with a big extra large pizza and a Diet Coke. He sees Dennis's message. Don't shoot up the school. Ah, he's right. That's wrong. What was I thinking? I was an extremist, but I'm not anymore. I'm going to take a step back. Here is where I was. Here is where I am. I am a new man. No longer will I shoot up the school. That is a ridiculous and false proposition that the government perpetuates through their insane theory that by posting, oh, please don't shoot up the school on the main board, that, oh, the gunman was here, but now he's here. He's a new man. Silly. So now let's move on. Okay? Extremists don't react to moderates. Okay? Yes.
What we've said is that there is a community which sort of envelops these budding extremists and turns them into very extremists which become violent. But secondly, we said that no, report them to the police, right? We didn't say like comment war them and stop them.
You're right. Except you're not. See? Let's look at it from this pedestal that I like to call common sense. Could you repeat your first point? I kind of went over my head.
We said this makes communities that
communities, right?
Budding
okay.
Radicals.
There's this community that exists in Afghanistan. Don't know if you've heard of them. They're called the Taliban. Okay, they don't exist on a containment board. They exist in real life. The government believes that somehow everything that exists in the world of discourse exists on the magical place called the internet. The fact of the matter is, even without containment boards existing, these physical places exist in real life. They exist in clan halls. Okay. All right? My father, never mind, this is recording. Okay? I'm just kidding, by the way. I love you, Dad. Okay? You look at any sort of extremist faction. They meet in physical places, okay? They can meet in the cafe not far from campus. Would you propose that we shut down cafes? That's a ridiculous proposition. I love my daily latte, but my wallet does not. Okay? Safe spaces. Safe spaces for extremists. Extremists surprise everyone, okay? Shooting up a school, okay? Look,
Trump was elected president. It was sad, okay? He came out, right? No one expected him. No one expected him to win. The Democrats should have won. The polls said the Democrats were going to win. Hillary Clinton was supposed to win. That's what the government says. That's what the government argues in the world. Except, maybe Hillary could have won if they didn't, I don't know, rig the primaries. I don't know, deny Bernie a fair shot at clenching the nomination. I don't know. Talk to 90% of the country that exists, okay? Look, here is this thing called the East Coast. Here's this thing called the West Coast, okay? Here's 99% of the United States of America, okay? So if Democrats have actually talked to people, and this tags into the heart of discourse, which means let's preserve containment boards so that people can talk with one another and so that we can have an incubator of ideas. So that at the end of the day, we can tuck in the ones we love most, kiss them on the forehead, and wish them a good night's rest. I yield back the balance of my time because there's no more important issue that we face.
Okay. So I have a ranking. I have a ranking. I think this was the Dev sweep. I think OG got the 1, CG got the 2, CO got the 3, and OO got the 4. So Gokul can, of course, now completely disagree.